My name is Josephine Bretherton. I first became interested in gardening. My mum used to tell me when she saw me sat on her lawn trying to get to eat a worm that was wriggling through my fingers that she grabbed off me in horror. But that was the start of my gardening, I'm convinced of it. My parents married in 1939, 1 month before the Second War was declared. Houses were unavailable, empty properties were commandeered to house refugees, families had to share living accommodation. We moved into our own home in 1947, a terraced house with a paved backyard. Mum was delighted to have her own home, but would often wistfully regale us with memories of her childhood, picking hops and cherries in her grandparents' garden in Kent as a little girl. Dad still travelled with his work. Mum was at home as a full-time housewife until my young sister started primary school. Mum was anxious to improve our standard of living after all the frugal years, thankfully, behind us. By 1950, all the hitherto hardships endured in the war years were becoming memories. Social conditions would never be the same again, but as a child I was unaware how things had been before the onset of war. Women had helped with war efforts by joining the forces or doing jobs in munition factories, releasing able men to fight. When peacetime returned, many women widowed in the conflict continued working to support their families. Some women relished their new independence and kept their jobs in peacetime. It was by then acceptable for women with families to go out to work. In their absence, it became a common sight in those days to see elder brothers and sisters taking charge of younger siblings. I had charge of my 7-year-old sister. Elderly labourers kept a watchful eye on our activities, reporting back to our parents how we behaved in their absence. In 1952, one summer holiday, left to my own devices, I decided to make a garden and planned to create a lawn in our backyard. It would be a lovely surprise for Mum when she came home from work and remind her of her long ago garden. Looking back, I cringe at the enormity of the task I had set myself at 12 years of age. I had a plan in my head. I knew where I could get free grass, and without further ado, I began. Labour was my first priority, I knew, so commandeered a neighbour's 10-year-old son to help, providing the muscle power. But the attraction of a game of football instead soon lured him away. My diminished workforce then consisted of myself, my 7-year-old sister, and her 5-year-old friend. Both had to be bribed with promises of a picnic, of jam butties and corporation pop, as lemonade was beyond our reach. I realised that transport was vital, so an old pram destined for the local rubbish tip was pressed into service, and off we set to Westwood Flash, a nearby beauty spot reached by crossing the Leeds and Liverpool Canal across the swing bridge. I located the grass I meant to use and set to, pulling out clumps of grass with my bare hands as I had no gardening tools to help me. In my tender years, grass was grass. I was not to know it was couch grass and the worst possible grass to use for an intended grass lawn. And it was full of creepy crawlers. An old chap stopped to ask what was I doing. When I told him, he shrugged and wished me, "Good luck, lass." Meanwhile, my remaining workforce had scoffed their buses and gone off to play. Undeterred, I returned home, left my sister in the care of a neighbour, then got back to my task of filling the pram with muddy, damp grass sods of couch grass. I remember my hands were very dirty and very sore. Well, after lunch the heavy labour began. I used Dad's chisel, which I inserted between the backyard flags. With half a brick, I hammered the chisel into the space between the flags, to lever them up. Once the flags were part lifted, I used Dad's coal shovel to rake the compacted soil from underneath that sent resident slugs and woodlice scurrying away. Then I dragged the flags across the yard as they were too heavy to lift. I stacked them out of the way as best I could. Phew! It was such hard work. Finally, I upended the pram, displacing its grassy contents, scattering loose soil and sods as best I could over the space I had made for the lawn. The effect was disappointing. It was a field, not a lawn, that I'd set out to surprise Mum with. I was so disappointed. During the following days, I realised that flowers would brighten up our backyard and pursued my objective by collecting jam jars and glass bottles that I could convert into hard cash. The local rag and bone man only gave out balloons or donkey brand stones in exchange for jam jars, etc. The grocer's shop would give the kingly sum of 1 penny per bottle. Financially sound, I could afford to buy a packet of seeds to create a real garden. I had befriended Mr. Meadows, a retired pitman and allotment gardener, and earned his goodwill by patrolling his vegetable beds, removing caterpillars. Confided in him of my cash flow predicament of starting my garden with only 1 packet of seeds, he obligingly donated a rhubarb crown, spring onions, flower seeds, and a root of mint. I dashed home to plant them. I would love to relate a success story, but no, everything died. That is, except for the weeds, ugly couch grass, bugs and brambles unwittingly brought in with the couch grass sods I had unearthed and brought home. They say everything comes to those who wait. True in my case. Nowadays I have a lovely garden and real gardening tools. I love nothing better than an opportunity to chat about gardening with anyone who cares to listen. Fortunately, health and safety was unheard of in my youth, which is just as well, thankfully, as we'd all have been locked up.